I suppose what the three of you have in common is in talking about design's role in democratising and innovating public engagement regarding policy, local government and community engagement to innovate democracy. It seems to me that you inevitably encounter tricky issues. So the question I have for all three of you is that in doing what you seek to do with local government, with policy, with community, how do we ensure that designers build trust? And also, how do we ensure that design is ethical? And I know that you've tried to engage with that, but I'm asking you again. So do you mind if I start with you, Sarah?
I think with the Public Collaboration Lab, the main way that we started to build trust was to actually co-design everything together, or even just to start with the discussions around it. So it's not that here's what we can offer. We didn't even go in and say here's what we can offer. We just started a discussion with the council and then with various different communities. So we had that open for it's about providing that space, which was mentioned just now, about having that space and that the things that we can do as designers, we can offer that open, de-risked space to have that conversation and build that trust. And that takes time. So I think time is the biggest thing here about discussing and
time and de-risk spaces.
And de-risk space, yeah.
So Lucy, can I ask you?
Yeah, I'll talk about in relation to a project that we're doing. So UAL is doing with 3 other universities and some other partners, which is addressing the potential and implications of AI for professional services firms, specifically law and accounting. So it's not a social policy project; it's an industrial strategy project funded by the UK government ultimately. And so the trust here is through we're doing a kind of social design-like activity in this multidisciplinary project. Something about porosity, being open to the boundaries between the different disciplines and expertises in the project, and we will have a lot of different workshops with people who think of themselves and literally define themselves as professionals, law firms and so on, but a porosity for participation, being aware of how we make claims about legitimacy. So, for example, I'm on this project and know very little about, or I know increasing amounts about AI, and I know a little bit now about law and accountancy in the UK, which are historically, anyway, so the legitimacy comes from not making claims to knowledge that when we don't have them, and also where necessary, involving the institutions in those but also being open to, I think somebody used the term earlier, edge conditions. And then transparency about what our intentions, the fact that in our case we're being funded by the UK government's industrial strategy, which is not a government that I personally support, but nonetheless I have taken their money, or we have taken their money, to try and do something that nonetheless has a space for critique and exploration and achieves solid academic outputs as well as outcomes that are meaningful for the groups, which in this case are law and accountancy firms and the stakeholders. And then finally, acknowledging the complexity of all of this and the complexity of the relations that the AI, why are we talking about AI in the UK now? Oh, it's because of the industrial strategy. Why is the UK industrial strategy focusing on AI? So the historical reasons and the ideological reasons that technologies such as that or infrastructures are seen as solutions to society's problems, or in this case business problems. So those are some of the things.
That's a really helpful answer. Before I go to Shana, I would just respond by saying that this morning we talked about tricking, or I quoted someone who tricked someone into tricking companies into making the right decisions. And actually I think that's what's wrong. I think that building trust is probably much more important, so that the answer to openness and collaboration makes sense. And to go to Shana, so I'm asking you the question in context of massive control narratives. Yeah. So I realise it's so difficult. How do you build trust?
One of the things that I reflected on a lot in thinking about the question of the public sphere, which I think is a question I think about less in terms of that exact term. So in taking it up, and I think some of the problematizations that both of you offered, to me, there is I think, I may change my mind about this, but I think that I believe that there's a fallacy in imagining that there's any sort of one public good. And so for me to say, to criticize, for instance, the process that actually was used to create these justice hubs, and I have many deep critiques of that. But to say that the problem was that certain people weren't at the table, were I to turn the light on my own work, there are all kinds of people I do not invite to the table on purpose, right? So the folks I work with would not be engaged in my work if there were police at the table, if there were prison guards at the table, if even sometimes there were people who were peripherally engaged in those systems at the table, because it would compromise their own work so deeply, right? Not just because they're mean or they don't feel like talking to them, but because it would compromise their work. And so I think, to me, part of building trust is also recognizing where we stand individually, right, or as a team of people or whomever, but our positionality in relationship to the political choices we're making in the work that we do. And that's being able to say, whatever the transparent thing is, the set of choices you've made around that particular work. And that might itself also shift, right? It might be tactical in moments, right? You might make different choices in different moments. And so to me, while I would ask the question, and have asked the question, if some people refused to come to the table who work on this thing, what made you think it was okay to move forward? And I think there have been some interesting projects in the United States where designers who are increasingly being engaged, both by cities, but also sort of engaging themselves in doing stuff around policing and incarceration, because it's become so sort of, I'm going to just say, popular as a topic, and what I mean by that is that just as a for instance, the level of police violence, the level of police killings, primarily of folks of color in the U.S. has not gone up. It's just that, well, thanks to The Guardian here, it's getting counted, right? It's also being publicized in a different kind of way. So I think, when I mean that people are becoming involved in that work, designers are becoming involved in the work, it's because they're identifying a problem that's long been identified as a problem, right? It's not a new crisis. And so I think that to me, part of the really critical importance around building trust is recognizing history, being willing to question whether you belong at the table yourself, and then if you don't quite fit there, figuring out if you really do have a stake, figuring out how to articulate that and how to build that into actual relationship. And so the last thing I'll say is that I think time is sort of, time and a willingness to become a person who becomes accountable for the work is one of the most important pieces of that trust building, right? If we're not accountable, if we can just walk away, we shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
Thank you. Great answer. Okay, so now to open up to the audience, are there any questions you'd like to raise? This one here. Gentleman. In here.
Thank you. No longer grey jacket, but red shirt. It strikes me that as designers who are potentially kind of dropping into these contexts, we need a reason to be there, which may be, professional. We may have been called in, I guess, but I think sometimes we need more of a reason, which is perhaps we're local, we're a citizen, a resident of that place. I think of things that I've participated in of this type as a designer, which have also been local to me, as in it's my borough, it's the place that I live, or it's the town in which I work.
Skin in the game.
So I think, do we need a reason to be there that makes our presence authentic, if you like, and means that we can't just walk away because we are of that place, in that place. We will remain once the project has finished. So I just wonder what the thoughts are on that.
Okay, should I start with you, Sarah?
I would definitely agree, and the Public Collaboration Lab is a collaboration that's been long-standing and goes back for well over 10 years, so a relationship that Design Against Crime have had with Camden Council, and that's got a lot to do with the fact that as an institution in that area, Central St Martin's has a responsibility to the place and the people that surround it, not just our students and our staff, but to the wider community. So I think I would definitely agree. And I think that it goes back to that longevity of the relationship is crucial and vitally important if we're to try and do anything that is meaningful and that can make a difference, even if it's only having those discussions and bringing out those difficult things. And that goes back to what you were saying earlier.
Lucy?
Yeah, so my chapter in the book includes a sort of double ethnography or dual ethnography, a bit of reflections on some time in Policy Lab, a team in the UK government, and also some attempts to bring a design-like set of activities to a branch of a political party, and during the same time. And I continue to do some minor local activism literally on my street. And so I find, though, that in the first it's somewhat easier. The legitimacy, I'm a researcher, I work in a university, I have an email address in an institution. There's an institutional apparatus that surrounds my inquiry, and the outputs that I'm supposed to produce and are meaningful include things that might be negotiated with that context, but also ultimately by my employer, which is a university, now that I have a full-time permanent job, and I would like to keep it. But in relation to the community and political party work that I do, it's more complex, because I go in saying, hi, I'm a researcher, or hi, I live here and I'm a member, but I'm going to be in research mode here. So the ethics are actually more complex when I'm in the political party, which has an agenda, which is to try and get in government, which it's not doing very well at. But actually also to the people in the room, I mean, on a really micro level, in the place that I live. So I do that much more slowly and cautiously, and then the insights, the insights and the conversations are qualitatively different, and their meaning is different, and where I might take them and what I might use them for is different. And so it's an open, confusing space, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think I spoke to it a second ago. So the one thing I would add, I think, is this kind of question of how do we understand the relationships that we have to a place or to other people? And I know it sounds really basic, but I think this understanding design as a sort of fundamentally relational practice, maybe not all design, right, but certainly the kind of work we're all talking about. I think we often think of it as a set of methods that you can deploy, or as a set of expertise that, I have that I can bring in. I actually not expert designer, but that one can bring in. But I really think that so much of what's actually happening there, the building capacity to then build or do anything, or even hear certain stories, so that they can become part of any kind of making practice at all, I think is so dependent on the willingness to take whatever time it takes to build the relationships you have. So I think that we can become smart at, wise about, invested in things that are not literally ours. I think that there are whole brilliant ways of thinking about this in political organizing work to do with allyship and coalition building. And I think there's both excellent writing about it and also really smart people who talk about it. And I think part of it is, again, understanding who we are in relationship to the work and then being intentional in that, right? So I think it's less about being authentic necessarily as it is about having intention and recognizing what that intention is, and also allowing it to shift from place to place, moment to moment, in a way, again, that's accountable. And I don't want to be throwing those words around as buzzwords. I'm thinking of them in actually very sort of concrete ways. What does it mean to walk into a room and know that my job that day might be to take the notes, right? My job that day might be to help facilitate, because, we in the organization where I work, that's what you do. You rotate the facilitation, because it's actually really hard work. And sometimes people are tired and they need to eat their burrito, So I think it's recognizing that context in that way is part of making place in a certain sense.
I think one of the points that was raised this morning was about sort of estrangement and the value of that. And I can see sometimes when you have skin in the game, it's very difficult to engage in a dispassionate and intellectual way, which is for the greater good. And so I think that it's really interesting what strategies can be used. But if I could go to the next question, which is in the third row. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks very much for your panel. It's a question for you all, but particularly stimulated by Shayna's observation of, in order to earn the relationships, to have the conversation with people who are presumably excluded for all sorts of historical and maybe colonial reasons. Here's a question, how do you broker a dialogue between a broader range of the parties involved in order to design something that may bridge some kind of the beginnings of a dialogue?
Yeah. So this is a question I've started to ask myself a lot. I think that I end up working in places where people are more like-minded than not. And I mean it in this very particular way. So they're oppositional spaces. So I'm working largely with social justice or activist organizations, groups of organizers who are already sort of in opposition to something and are less interested except in very strategic ways, at being at the table to make a sort of larger goal. I think that the construction of the idea is that and to go back to the sort of New York City example, that's not work I'm personally involved in. I'm just following it very closely. It's actually incredibly complex because the Close Rikers movement was started by organizations of former prisoners, organizations, sort of larger scale service organizations, tons and tons of people not in city government, but with various relations to city government. It got taken up by the mayor and the city council, and it became a whole thing, which we don't have time to get into, but it's interesting to look at. When it became that thing, part of what got made was this sort of idea that if you got all the right people in the room, you had participants, you had people who'd experienced the jail, if you had people who were family members, loved ones who'd been in jail, guards, et cetera, that then you could design a better, more ethical jail. So they tried that, right? And they put forward this plan, this $10.4 billion plan with these justice hubs that are sort of in the boroughs, not in the most conservative borough, oddly, in the city. But anyway, and not those first organizations, but a second group of organizations and people came up and said, this is not a victory. We cannot close Rikers to invest $10.4 billion in new jails. And so now we have to, with deep discomfort, go against our allies and say this is not a victory, and we have to start a new movement. And that, the political tensions in the city around this right now, I can tell you, run very deep and they're incredibly complicated. But people determined that they couldn't actually sit at that table and move this plan forward or try to ameliorate it or make it a little better. And so I think one sort of long way of trying to get at that answer is that I think there are times where, as designers, certainly, we might have to recognize and understand sort of what is happening on the ground, and then pick a place to enter, right? And I don't want to make it necessarily about picking sides, but I mean, and this gets back to the ethical consideration, make a decision about the ethics of the situation. And if I am a person, and I am not personally, but if I am a person who thinks that there is a way to design a better, sort of more humane jail, and that feels like an important step, I might take that work. If I am a person, and this is where I am situated, who doesn't think that one can design a humane jail, I might align myself with folks who are working to stop all jails. And I know there was a lot of text on one of those slides that I showed, but take up all of these other strategies around reducing policing, reducing arrests, increasing access to housing, all of these other kind of contingent increasing access to mental health care, which, for anyone who doesn't know, in the United States, so many people who are locked up, especially in city and county jails, are people who have either been kicked out of and or don't have access to mental health facilities or just regular everyday care. Anyway, all of this is to say that I think we actually do have to position ourselves where there are positions, and that for designers to imagine that we can somehow bring people together and resolve those tensions, I think that's where we miss steps so often. It doesn't mean that we can't do complicated things or sit inside those complexities, but I think to act as if we can kind of make them go away or be objective in some way because we're coming from the outside in some instances, I think belittles the very real work that people are already doing on the ground. So I feel like we have to do our research and then figure out where we sit. And it may be that we manage to bring different coalitions of people together who otherwise would maybe not have been sitting together. But I don't think we can ignore the reasons why people might not be together in the first place. I don't know if that answers the question, but those are my thoughts on it.
I just want to add a small thing. So these intersections, in particular with political structures between politics and government and design, are still at a very early stage of development, and notwithstanding some of the things we're hearing today, but the research is still quite early. UAL currently has a series of 4 studentships with King's College London, specifically on this topic, where the students are supervised by scholars from politics and government. And we've just accepted the 4th student to this, who's going to look at democratic innovations, which is sort of over here in politics and government and has very little to do with the design approach that we're talking about. They use the word, that literature, and I know this from the candidates interview, that literature uses the word design but doesn't actually discuss what they mean by design. So, we need to design new democratic institutions and make new democratic innovations. And so the cross-disciplinarity and these kind of forms of practice are still quite open.
I just think, leading on from the point that was made just now, Adam talks about it in the book, so go back to the book, about negotiating expectations rather than managing expectations. It's not necessarily our job as the designer to manage those expectations, but maybe it's about getting the right people around the table to negotiate what those are.
Are there any more questions? So we've got one in the front here, and then one at the back. Thank you.
This just kind of follows on from the discussion that you've just been having, but it's, I guess, the flip side of that. So we've been talking about ethics a lot this morning. We talked about designing interventions now, and I think one of the kind of implicit presumptions there is that I think, Shane, you just put it quite nicely. We have to figure out where we're at or where we're coming from. So there's a kind of ethical deliberation that's going on in the designer. So what I wanted to ask, maybe each of you just to answer, if you're able, what is the social unit for that ethical deliberation for the designer? I hear implicitly the individual a lot. I hear implicitly probably not the nation state. I'm on board with that. But if it's not those things, what might it be? At present, what might we want it to be if we were thinking aspirationally?
Can you just say that again?
Yeah, so what's the social unit for ethical deliberation? Is it the design school? Is it the local neighborhood? Is it, buddies at a pub? Is it the individual person sitting in a room with the windows closed, thinking deep thoughts, sort of, where do we sort out our ethics as designers?
Can I answer that? So from the point of view of being in a university, so we have to have an ethics committee because we are a we, we're not just an I. And so it's really important that we don't take dirty money to work with companies. It's really important that we have procedures. And so I think that, it depends where you're located would be the answer to the question. For me, I'm located in a particular place, but I work on crime. And to respond to Shane, I have been troubled. I work in prison. Am I making it worse? Am I collaborating with the enemy? The reality in Britain, we have, at a time in global history when crime has gone down, our prison population has gone up. And we cannot avoid the fact that since 2008 they've dumped the mental health patients, they've dumped the homeless in prison. And so I asked myself, why am I there? And I'm there because I think I can make a difference. I'm not there to collaborate with the Ministry of Justice. I'm there because actually I believe in humanity and making it better. Now, am I complicit? I've been told but I get told off by everybody, so I'm usually told off, and it's, I don't care. My thing is I see on a day-to-day basis people change. We have PhD students who are former offenders. We have MA students. If we can offer a place out of the prison into a new reality, for me, my job is in the right direction. But there are these tricky dilemmas, and that you can never answer them honestly. Because it's a bit like, well, it's 90% this, and so maybe it's in percentage terms that we'd give you the answer. But for me, it's about where I'm located and what it means. I don't know if... Okay, I saw there was a question at the back. Would you like to raise a question?
Thank you. I think your discussion has made me think a lot about different positions. And I think there are two that we are comparing here, or maybe they're implicitly in some of the things you say. And one is that we want more participatory approaches because they are more democratic. But on the other hand, when we don't like the outcomes of that democratic process, or we think they go against our own values, we have the option of staying and saying, well, I do the best I can, or say, no, I just can't sit on this table. And I think in many different projects, we might be taking different positions in different projects, but I think that's a dilemma that we all face, you know. So is that a way of putting it, explaining it, and how do we make those choices?
I mean, I think someone spoke to this earlier about how the language of making something participatory often becomes a cover for a decision that includes everyone. And I think as someone who has a deep investment in participatory design as a field and the sort of politics from which that field grows, I think it actually sort of leads into this question of where we set our ethics, sort of in relation to whom, and frankly, to whom do we? I know I keep using this word, but to whom do we feel accountable, right? So, to me, I think Mahmoud brought up an idea around language in your work earlier about people with whom you're working might say, you can say this if you put it in this context, right? I think that's one way of being accountable, is using people's language in a way that is respectful. I think the thing that's striking to me about all of the participatory, and they all have been, I shouldn't even put it in quotes, all of the participatory processes that designers have been using to design jail or prison and police reform, it's not that they're not participatory. It's not as if people affected by policing are not at the table. They absolutely are. The question is, if you look, and there was a lot on those slides, but if you look at the questions that get posed, and maybe it's because it's this, so far a lot of this work is architects, and the architects are thinking about the buildings. But always at the center of every question is the building that they already intend to build. How do you make a police station that does X? How do you make a jail that does Y? And so it doesn't matter who's at the table unless you're also allowed to refuse the question, and that has power. So I think to me, one of the most important differences between a sort of participation that is people in the room and participation that is a belief in, and this is, I think, the ethical question, a belief in people's power to derail something or to articulate what needs to be, in some sense, to me, that's the difference between a participatory process that can go off the rails and still do something or produce something, and one that really can only work if it stays within the bounds of usually what are sort of a politically scripted set of possible outcomes. There's an interesting statement at the very end of the Justice in Design brochure, which is a gazillion pages long, that has the two pieces that I showed, that essentially says a lot of complicated things came up and we didn't have space for all of them because we had to deliver a design. And that statement is really fascinating to me because it is, I would argue, the fundamental ethical problem with what happened. What did people say that you couldn't include because it didn't result in a jail, right? And so to me, the social unit can be the individual, right? What are my ethics? But it can also be at the table I'm at, or in the program I'm working with, or with this particular project, we are gonna set these principles, and then what do we do? So the work I've done, that part is easy because I'm working with organizations that have a very clear mission statement. If something runs counter to that mission statement, right, and it allows us interesting, tricky space around things like what Critical Resistance calls non-reformist reform, right? How do you have impacts on people's daily conditions without making the system itself stronger? How are you pulling people out? How are you focusing on decarceration? How are you doing all these different kinds of work? So I would argue that those ethics get set in different places, but that the trick of participation is actually accounting for what the nature of that participation was, and God forbid, being honest about it. In publication, I think would be amazing to see what those limitations were if designers felt like we could speak to it.
Is everything. That's what you're really saying.
I think context and commitment, right?
Context and
so
commitment.
I think carrying something through is important.
Okay, before we go for our next break, is there a final question? We have time for one more. No, okay, let's thank everybody. Thank you.